Good evening, everybody. My name is Cooper Hibbard. Hi. Very grateful to be here. This is my first time in Malta. Actually, the first time I've ever been in this part of the state. And Dave Ward, who I work with over here in the black vest and marine shirt, we drove up here. First time either of us have been in this part of the state. And we're talking the entire time. And then we hit the Milk River, which is, well, we just stopped talking for miles because we were so astounded by that country, that river bottom that's, I don't know how many miles wide. It's unlike anything I've seen in the state. But we're talking about it and it's just like, man, the potential here is incredible. And Dave made the comment of the potential's right there, here in the spot. We've had to create our potential. And so any of us here in this room can do that. There's potential whether you create it or whether it's given to you or whether it's sitting there waiting to be tapped. It's there. And so this is just some amazing country. So thanks for the invitation. So Seed and Livestock is outside Cascade, Montana, which is on the east side of the Big Belt Mountains. We're south of Cascade. And go ahead and hit the next slide. So we're a family ranch. I'm part of the 5th generation. And historically, we were a sheep ranch and then sheep and cattle. And then when we were cattle, it was full throttle, conventional calving in February and March. And about 20 years ago, we changed our calving date to June to try and better match our cow's production cycle with the natural grass cycle of our place. Because up until that point, it really felt like we were trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. Our ranch's resource base is, if you had to map it out, volume-wise, we'd be like an inverse pyramid where our winter zone would be the bottom strata, or what we call our shoulder country. The transition zone would be that middle strata, and then the top would be our summer grass. So we're really heavy in summer grass, very limited in our winter country, and all of what we do is dictated by our winter resources. And so that was the bottleneck for how many cattle we could run and how we could run them. And so this 15-minute presentation is going to basically try and sum up what we've learned in 20 years of a lot of mistakes and a lot of falling flat on our face and a lot of figuring things out and a lot of people's observations and piecing things together. But we did that to try and match our cow's production cycle, the natural grass cycle of where we are at a higher altitude than here. And so by doing that, it allowed us to not only match our resource base to our enterprises, it also gave us some more marketing flexibility, but it also allowed us to winter graze, which has turned out to be our biggest unfair advantage now. We've turned our biggest weak point, that bottom of the pyramid, into our biggest unfair advantage. And what seems like people are pretty hard pressed to compete with what we're doing. And we're only allowed to do that because our cows are in their 2nd and 3rd trimester throughout the winter. That's a different ball game than if you're calving in March or in April. You could still do a lot of this. The principles apply, but it is a different ball game. And so 20 years ago, these photos are in our winter grazing ground, which is mostly native, but there's some improved pastures. This would be one improved pasture. That's Dave walking through some of our winter grazing area. But so 20 years ago, when we started winter grazing, our graze periods were about seven days long. And then when I came home in 2013, the average graze period was about 4.5 days long. But we're still having to feed what we call our mob, which are 4-year-olds and up, for about 30 to 45 days, just to buy time. Just it wasn't because of weather, it was to buy time because we're out of grass. And so since 2013 and today, we're now resting a section and a half. We're resting 45 to 60 days worth of grass because we don't need it. It's not because our cow numbers have gone down. It's because the amount of grass that we're growing has increased, and then our harvest efficiency has increased. And so if you flash forward to present day, what we're doing now are non-selective grazes, one-day grazes, if not more. And so what's happening when you're doing non-selective grazing is every single plant's affected, and so every single plant is then put on a level playing field. And when that happens, the plants with the deepest root systems and the broadest leaf areas are the plants that outcompete in that scenario. And so by default, you're selecting for your desirable species. Those are your desirables. So plants with the deepest root systems, broadest leaf areas, more often than not are your desirable species. And by non-selective grazing, you're increasing your harvest efficiency because every single plant that isn't grazed, or more plants are grazed, and those that aren't are trampled. And so a byproduct of non-selective grazing is you're putting more litter on the ground, so you're therefore building soil, so you're in essence putting money in the bank account. You're investing in the future, right? And by moving every single day, our cows are seeing fresh feed every day, and that's how we're impacting their body condition. And so for those of you who are familiar with Johann Zeitzman, those of you who aren't, buy his book. The guy's amazing. He's really pieced a lot of things together. He really talks about a genetic high relative intake. So the amount that one animal can eat in relation to its body size and how important that is as a genetic trait. And that's something that you can select for. But I don't think that it's just genetic. I think you can influence that with your management as well. And so what I mean by that is picture that there's cows that we're on the left side, right? And then when we go out to do a move, which Dave over here, he's the guy. He's the one who does all of this. So feel free to ask Dave questions, or Dave call me out if I'm too full of BS or anything. But you can go ahead and go to that next slide. So when we do a move, you pull the wire and then you have access to fresh feed. Well, one of the rules of thumb that we operate by after so many mistakes is move them when they're full. If you move them when they're full, that whole mob mentality, frenetic behavior that you hear about, mob grazing, that can really work against you, or you can take that and it's another tool and you can make it work for you. And that's what I mean by that is if you move them when they're full, they'll start eating before they would otherwise because they don't want that other cow to get that. And so by management, you're increasing their high relative intake. And so that's also how you can impact their body condition. And so when I said in the video that last year, without supplement, we fed 200 pounds per cow to get through the polar vortex. Without supplement, in 5 months, just grazing on native range, we increased body condition by 3/4 of the body condition score. We went from 5 to 5 3/4, and that was with 2 outside assessments from 2 different nutritionists. Both scored them at 5 3/4. And that's how. Moving them when they're full, under fresh feed every single day. It's an incredible tool, I believe. Next slide. So this is what it can look like. Dave took this photo. This is in our winter grazing area. So water would be on the back side of that rocky reef. And this right here is what we call a break fence. And so the next day, Dave would go up and he'd build the next fence down below, let's say where that shadow line is, and he'd come up and roll this next one up, and the cows are moved. So he just fed 1,000 cows in an hour or so. Yep. So next slide. So this whole non-selective grazing one-day deal, we kind of fell into it. I mentioned in 2013 when I came home, our average graze period was about 4.5 days. And then it was 3 days, and then it was 2 days, just because we liked seeing the results and everything was just moving towards the positive. And then we started moving every day, and we set up an experiment. And first off, every day actually, for most cases, it sounds like more work. It wasn't. It's less poly. You're going to go out and check them anyways if it's every 2 days. The cows are less bored because that competitive grazing, and then they're full, and then they're done. They ruminate. They don't go and get into trouble and break out. And every time they break out, that's a few hours of putting them back in and fixing the poly, going back, turning the charger off, on, fixing the poly, turning the charger back on. So we set up this experiment where it was a 1-day non-selective graze on the right and a 2.5-day graze on the left. This was where a polywire was. And that's my uncle, that's the head honcho, coming to check and see what crazy things we're up to. And so we went and looked at this. And next photo. So this is on the right side of that fence. I just took the camera and took it down and snapped a photo. And you can see all the litter that's laid down, all the manure that's trampled in, how severely impacted everything is. Everything's impacted. There's a lot of energy that just got infused into that ground. Next. So again, here's that fence line. The 2.5-day graze on the left, that looks better currently, right? It's like, oh, that wasn't abused. The one on the right's like, I don't know. Next photo. So here's that same fence line. I don't know if you guys can see this. Can you guys see that? Where on the right side, it's really dark, rich green. Does it show up on this? Left side, it doesn't. So that right side of the fence, that grass is that's throwing a party. It's having whatever we did, it liked. It told us that it needed that. That's the relationship and the interaction that it prefers. So that's a 1-day graze, high density. Get them there, get them hard, get them off. And then we're gone. And we're gone for a year, year and a half. We don't come back. Next photo. And that's same rough SQ plant 45 days later. That's my cowboy hat. It's probably up to here, so. Next photo. So we've had some pretty incredible ecological successes with doing this. We've increased our productivity. We've essentially created more life by grazing how we've grazed in our winter grazing ground. And by doing that, we've increased our economic resiliency as well. So in 6 years, which are some of the 6 driest years in the history of the ranch, on average, when you put all of our winter grazing past years together, we've increased our productivity by 200%. That's a 3-fold increase. And what that means is it's a hay savings of $85,000 per year for us. And we've increased the size of our ranch. We've basically added on, remember that the tip of the pyramid? We were just handed 2 more of those. 2 more winter grazing units. And where we are, you can't lease that. It's just not an option. The ground doesn't change hands over there. You have what you have. We were handed 2 more of those for the cost of our mistakes and learning to get to that point. Another huge success is the people component. People are empowered, fulfilled, they have a sense of purpose. Dave, one of Dave's quotes, I already said one quote in the video of Dave's of how getting your cattle to work for you. If you work for them, they'll work for you all day long. That's a Dave quote. Another Dave quote is that he's changing the world one bite at a time through the work that he's doing. Because you feel that. You're out there every day and you see these successes. I mean, that's incredibly empowering. But there's been some pretty serious challenges along the way. One is also people and social. If people aren't bought in, it's pretty hard. Whether people mean to or not, things will get sabotaged. And then there's a component that a lot of people are scared of being the weird person on the road. We've always been the weird person on the road. And in fact, I'd argue that if you aren't being the weird person, then you might not be doing enough. Because what's happening normally, it doesn't look good. I don't want to do that. We've got to figure out a different way, and you can only do that if you push the envelope and if you're willing to stick your neck out and be a little courageous to take those first few steps. And I suppose for us, we've always been the weird person. Our desire to do right by the ground outweighed our fear of being ostracized or laughed at in the community. Animal performance, that's real. Grazing too hard and doing non-selective grazing before you get things dialed in, you can fall flat on your face in no time. It's no joke, it's very technical. My uncle equates it, say you're more laid back breast rotation grazing is a Model T. What we're doing is a Ferrari. So if you wreck, it's serious. However, I would also argue that when you get it dialed in right, it's the next level, where it is a win-win-win across the board, like what Dave pulled off with our winter grazing last year, with 0 supplement and gained 3/4 of the body condition. The economics, because of the animal performance, if you don't get it right, it can also be pretty serious. And then the genetics, it became glaringly obvious to me once our grazing got to a certain point that our grazing management had outpaced our genetics. This is directly tied to and correlated with animal performance. Genetics are huge. High doability on grass, adaptability to your environment, ability to perform for your environment, which includes your management, is something that isn't talked about enough, and that's a whole nother topic, but has been a huge focus of ours in dialing in our genetics and what we think that we need to see and how you select for that, or how you get out of the way and let Mother Nature select for that while building a bank account, not breaking the bank. And so here are a few rules of thumb that we've come by very honestly for non-selective grazing. One I've already talked about, move when they're full. Fresh feed as frequently as possible. So for us, our happy medium currently is move every day. Fresh feed every day. I'm not saying you have to do that, that's just us. The principle is fresh feed as frequently as you can. When in doubt, which happens, you show up and you're like, I don't know, maybe we should move them. We might be able to make it till tomorrow, move them. Because I've gotten sucked into that rabbit hole time and time again. And animal performance, this is directly tied to the next one. Animal performance should outweigh your ecological impact or what you'd like to improve. Or you can always do it, make it happen next year. Your cows need to be there for you next year if you're going to make it happen. If cows are discontent, if they're not happy, something's off. Something needs changed, and that can be super important. They can be discontent because of water, or even though there's all the water in the world. We had an instance 2 winters ago where we were maybe 1.25 miles from water, and the cows were doing great. And then all of a sudden, they just started getting dull and kind of slab-sided, and a little unhappy. And Dave and I were like, what's going on here? Turns out they weren't taking themselves into water anymore. We didn't know why. So Dave had to, for about 3 or 4 days, trail them into water, and all of a sudden it turned, and they snapped out of it and started taking themselves into water again. Weird things like that can happen. But if something's off, nip it in the bud, and it can stop a real wreck. And then the common denominator between all of them, behind all of this, is stockmanship. It's kind of what I was talking about in that video. Working your cows in a manner where they're in a good frame of mind, that they can trust you, and that they're happy to be where they are, makes all of this possible. So that's all I got.
Got a few minutes for questions, so I don't have to call and just go and shout it out.
Yeah, it's kind of a three-part question. What did your ground and grass look like when you started? How did you start? And did you add seed because you showed grass and then flowers?
Most of it's native range. Yeah. So it was, how did it look when we started? I don't really know. I wasn't around with, I wasn't that involved 20 years ago to the point where I remember, but I do remember there being large bare patches of soil. Like if you were to put 5 or 6 of these tables together, you can't find those anymore. There's a few monitoring transects down in our winter grazing zone. They're all at 0% bare soil now, and the biggest change went from 23% bare soil, I believe, down to 0% in 5 years. Just from grazing. And there was PJ made a comment earlier about creating the conditions, building it and they will come. And it made me think I need to take this photo. A neighbor of ours put in a stock water development, live water, and just a spring fed, and the overflow just goes out onto this hillside that was native range, like what you're seeing in these photos and the video. And it's been there 2 years. Out in the middle of nowhere, not close to any body of water. And there's cattails growing there now. When did the cattail seeds get there? You know, so it's like, if you give that ground, you create the environment that it needs, and it shows up.
You ever get caught with snow and have to feed hay?
Oh yeah.
Hay on hand?
Yeah, and that's another rule of thumb that I didn't put up. And again, I come by this honestly, I'm fairly stubborn. And so it took getting this pounded in my head a few times, but feeding on the front end of storms, if you see a storm's gonna come, I'd usually be the guy who's like, oh, we'll see what it's like, and then we'll decide whether or not we need to feed time and time again. I did that. Feeding on the 2 days before the storm hits makes a huge difference, huge. And I would argue that you'd actually feed less hay. So I would not be scared to feed hay. Again, I'd err on the side of caution, and then ratchet back from there. Once you build up in confidence, I wouldn't be like, oh, we're going to make our cows do this. Yeah. I was overconfident many times.
You talked a lot about genetics. What was your process like as you were changing your genetics to from where you started to where you are now? Did you just liquidate your cows and just buy new, or was it a gradual process?
Gradual process. So first off, I'm a big believer in composites and in the science behind composites. True composites, which are 3 to 5 breeds, 5 or more is better in the same hide, right? So that's in one animal. And so the science behind that, like if you have a F1 cross, a Black Angus Hereford, that calf is has 100% hybrid vigor. But then the subsequent calf out of that is 50%, and then 25%, so it gets diluted by half by 50% every generation. So a composite is 83 to 80% hybrid vigor effect, heterosis effect, that doesn't get diluted from generation to generation. So you capture that, and all the benefits from hybrid vigor, which some economists in Kansas State equated it to about $200 more of unseen revenue per cow per year, just through higher fertility, higher longevity, but 30% more doability on grass, et cetera, more disease resistant. And so that's one component. And then Johann Zeitzman says that's just a side benefit. He says that the main point to doing composites or mixing and matching breeds, because there's no one thing that a perfect breed doesn't exist. Sorry, there's registered breeders in here. And so you can take the strengths from each different breed and try and mix and match for your environment, for how you want your life to be and what your ground has to offer. I'm a big believer in that. And so we've been doing black composites for a while, and we started selecting a lot of our own bulls. And it's all about body condition, right? Body condition is everything. This is again Zeitzman influence. It's fertility, it's milking ability, it's calf health, it's calf weight gain, it's breed back, it's longevity, which is a function of fertility. We all talk about longevity and how it's just, a cow won't be around long if she isn't fertile, you know. And so we tried to design our genetic selection criteria for those traits. And so we select our bulls. It's kind of a two-pronged approach. One is we go in to our mob, 6 years old and up. This is something that Dave does, and they need to calve in the first cycle. And those that do, that are 6 years old and up, that are body condition 6 or more, slicked off coat, which I think is huge. That's a big sign of they're firing on all cylinders, and a good udder, good feet, good mothering instinct, moderate frame or less, and just happens to have a bull calf. I don't care what the bull calf looks like, he gets a tag in his left ear, because when we brand, they get processed on the left side. So when that calf comes in, he stays intact. And then he just gets rolled in, not treated any special at all, no special treatment. And we'll take measurements at 12 months of age on them. They're run with our steers over the winter. So they get run through our yearling program just to see how they do in that program. And so once they're 12 months of age, we'll weigh them individually, and then we'll take their individual hip height measurements and put that into a ratio. So you're measuring the amount of weight per vertical centimeter. So the amount of their meat to bone ratio, how dense of a package they are. Because once the testosterone kicks in, they stop growing. And so there'll be early sexual maturing, there'll be a meatier package basically. And so that has a higher propensity for fertility in your heifers. And that's a main component for what we select on. And then the second way that we select is we take a bull and we put them in, or bulls, and put them in early on our calving first calf heifers, 30 days after they start calving. And they're in for a month. Then they get pulled. And then 30 days later is when the rest of the bulls go in. That's a normal bull turnout date. So they're in 60 days earlier, and then they get pulled 30 days earlier than they should. So what happens in that scenario where bulls pick up and breed the elite of the elite, the most fertile heifers of that age class. And then they calve 2 months earlier, and we know that those calves are out of that bull, and this is where we're building our own composite with other breeds that we think will make kind of strengthen our balance sheet, our genetic balance sheet. Those calves stay intact and become our bulls. And same deal, that selection criteria is based off of the hip height measurement once they're yearlings.
All right, let's give Cooper one more hand. Cooper, I just wanted to say, everyone from Blaine County